Hey, and thanks for taking the time to watch this week's Oldtown short, The Voice of God. Friends, I have a few questions for you today. Are you ready? Do you long for God's presence in your life? Do you experience God more in noisy, busy moments of life, or when life is quiet and still? And it's okay to answer both or neither. And finally, if God called you to do something difficult, how would you respond? There's a man in the Bible named Elijah, and Elijah was searching for God. He was longing for God's presence in his life and waiting to hear God's voice so that he would know what to do next. I wonder if you've ever felt like Elijah. Perhaps something happened in your life and you wanted God to give you a sign or to help you feel that everything would be okay. But you find that the more you long for God, the more empty you feel. My friends, there are many times in our lives that we long for God's presence, and we start to get frustrated when we can't hear God's voice. It seems like the world around us is spinning too fast and God is nowhere to be found. Have you ever felt that way? It can be a terrible feeling, can't it? But let me give you a little hint. Usually when that happens, the problem isn't with God. The problem is with us. You see, this man, Elijah from the Bible, had been longing for God's presence, and he wanted to hear God's voice. But he'd been running from King Ahab and his army for 40 days and 40 nights. I'm sure that he was afraid he'd be caught. And just like we sometimes do, I'm sure that he'd been running all of the possible scenarios of what might happen over and over in his head. Elijah wants to hear from God, but has he taken a deep breath? Has he slowed down and actually listened for God's voice? Friends, like Elijah, in our prayer lives, we're very good at telling God about our wants and our needs, and the wants and the needs of others. We're even pretty good at thanking God for the gifts in our lives. But for some reason, we get frustrated when we ask God a question and God doesn't respond. But the truth is, my friends, the problem is not usually that God doesn't respond. The problem is that we don't have the patience to listen. I want you to think about that for just a minute. The problem isn't usually that God doesn't respond. The problem is that we don't have the patience to listen. Because you need to have patience to pay attention, and sometimes we need to wait. And though we may not always do good at those things, they're absolutely necessary if we want to feel the presence of God in our lives, and if we want to hear God's call. Elijah was told to go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, because the Lord was about to pass by. When Elijah stood there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks into pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. Elijah couldn't hear God in the wind, or in the earthquake, or in the fire. He needed to wait for the silence. And that may be true for you too. But the fact is, though it may be more difficult to hear God in the midst of the wind and in the earthquake and in the fire and in the busyness of our lives, that doesn't mean that God's not there. It just means that we're distracted by what's happening around us. And it means that the hustle and bustle of the world has taken our attention away from God. Friends, we have had silence in our worship for 1.5 years now. Besides a few background sound effects from my dog Rufus and my cat Cornbread, worship has been pretty silent. Now, some of you may have enjoyed the silence. It may have been easier to take a deep breath and to listen. But I'll be honest, I can't wait for a little more worship noise. Friends, one of our treasures in Oldtown is our children. And we know that sometimes they might make a little noise in worship. But you know what? Sometimes our adults do too. But those giggles and laughs and shared thoughts and ideas are some of the things that I can't wait to hear again on Sunday mornings. I can't wait to hear God's voice again in a baby's cry, or in the whispers of children, in the slamming of pew doors, or in the restless feet that can't reach the floor so they tap on the back of their seat. I can't wait to hear God's voice and the questions and the thoughts and the dreams and the prayers of our congregation when we gather next week. Or in the greetings and conversations as people gather together again. But friends, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that we all need practice. It's been 1.5 years since we've sat in person worship, so we need to be patient as we all learn to sit again. As we remember what in-person worship is like, and as we learn new ways to listen for and to hear God's still speaking voice. Remembering that sometimes it takes a village, or at least a caring church family, to help with that. Friends, speaking of voices, for 1.5 years, all that you have heard, with a few exceptions, is my voice in our online worship services. And it's my hope and my prayer that that changes as we get back to in-person worship. For those of you that only worship online with us, don't worry, because our Oldtown shorts will still continue even after we resume in-person worship next week. And hopefully, we'll find other ways to continue to share pieces of Oldtown online. But friends, wherever and however you worship, be assured that God is always with you in the silence and in the noise and in the commotion. Sometimes you just need to wait and be patient and listen. Our friend Elijah couldn't hear God in the wind, or in the earthquake, or in the fire. But he did hear the voice of God in the sound of silence. He'd been hoping and praying that God would tell him what to do, and God did. But it wasn't the call that Elijah was looking for. You see, God told Elijah to return to where he had come from, for there was more work to be done in Israel. And though Elijah was afraid, he did what God asked him to do, because Elijah trusted God. My friends, sometimes God calls us to do things that are difficult, but be assured that no matter how scary or how impossible God's call might seem to you, God always equips us for the call. So, brothers and sisters in Christ, whether you're heading back to in-person worship with us next week or staying here online, know that God is always with you, guiding your steps and sometimes even pushing you in the right direction. And be assured that whoever you are and wherever you are on life's journey, that you can hear the voice of God. Sometimes you just need to listen.